Hello all, how are we all doing? First off, we're going to start with a couple of apologies. Number one, the sound probably isn't great because I've had to open the windows because it's boiling today. And number two, we're in the office, which I hate because I'm an outdoors photographer, so every time I do a video indoors, it feels like a failure. The reason for that, very simply, is sleep deprivation. As many of you warned me about, our little boy has decided at 4 weeks old that sleep actually isn't one of his favourite things. That's a lie. It is one of his favourite things, but he hates to do it at times that are convenient to Emily and me. So, it means we don't sleep. It's hard that, isn't it, as new parents? We're finding it quite difficult. Yesterday, I put a dishwasher tablet in the fridge and wondered why the food wasn't getting clean. The day before that, I spelt my name wrong on a form. My name's James. It's not a difficult name to spell. Anyhow, despite the fact we're indoors, today what we're going to talk about is some tips on getting more keepers. And not necessarily the creative side of getting more keepers, not things like composition or settings, none of that. But instead tips to make sure that you come home with the photos that you envisage or that you imagined from particular scenes. I hope that makes sense. In photography, you might have noticed a lot of the time we talk about the importance of backing up and making sure that you store images on multiple hard drives in different places and make use of cloud services, things like that. But it's also important to make sure that you get those photos in the first place, obviously. And 90% of the time you probably won't need any of these tips. But these tips I think are helpful for times when things go a little bit wrong. What's the sound like? Is it bad? Shall I try with the windows closed for a minute? How's that? Any better? So, tip number one. When you arrive at a location, make sure that you take a snapshot before you worry about perfecting things like your composition and your settings. Often when we arrive at a scene that we think has potential for a photo, we'll start kind of scouting around for the perfect composition and then we'll start considering what the exact settings we want are. But the trouble is, in the time it takes between arriving at a location and getting our perfect shot, the conditions may worsen. And whenever that happens and you've not got a shot as soon as you arrived, you're going to leave home empty-handed, or at least with a worse shot than you might have done if you'd just taken an imperfect shot when you first arrived. And I say an imperfect shot just because it might not be the exact composition you wanted or the settings, but the conditions might be incredible and you might decide that that is the photo you prefer as opposed to perfect composition, perfect settings, but maybe the light's off, maybe the subject has gone home, whatever it might be. In any case, it's safest to just get something in the bank the minute you arrive at a location. And that's a practice that I've strived to do, well, for a couple of years now, and it's held me in good stead. Number two, bracketing. Now there are lots of incredible tools in modern cameras to help us find the perfect exposure. Things like histograms, things like zebra patterns, all kinds of different stuff that helps us work out if we've got a decent exposure or not. The problem with these tools, or there are a few problems with these tools, is that often with regard to histogram, it's based off of a JPEG on lots of cameras. So if you're shooting RAW, then you're actually not getting an accurate representation of the detail that's been captured. And the second problem with these things is they take time to try and work with. I mean, if you're observing a zebra pattern, for example, or a histogram, then you're going to be looking at the camera and not necessarily the scene out in front of you. What I prefer to do is just eyeball the exposure, get it roughly right, and then bracket. And the beauty of bracketing is that it really doesn't take very long at all. In the space of half a second, depending on your shutter speed, you could end up with a shot that's one stop underexposed, one stop exposed how you think you should be exposing, and a stop brighter than that. And then when you get home, you're bound to have an exposure that works, even if you've been shooting in a really dynamic scene. And of course that could be the case if you just nailed your exposure in camera as well. But the time it takes to do that may well mean that you miss the best of the conditions. And of course every time the conditions shift, particularly if you're shooting somewhere like woodland where the sun is going in and out of clouds, you need to then monitor the histogram and start all over again. So bracketing, I find, is a good way to go about making sure that you go home with an exposure that will work. And yeah, I'd highly recommend it. Can't see many downsides, to be honest. Obviously it fills your cards faster than it would just taking one exposure, but I think it's worth it. And I should say here that I very rarely blend those exposures in Lightroom or any other software. I just have 3 of them to make sure that I've got an exposure that I'm happy with. Tip number 3 is to constantly question your composition. Now I know all too well the temptation to take a photo and think, oh, it might get better here, so I'm just going to stand here for another hour and see if it does. In my experience, more often than not, you're better off once you've got a good photo from one place, going off to try and get a variation of that photo, and then a variation of that photo, and you go home with half a dozen different photos from different places. And more often than not, in my experience and in the experience of other photographers that I talk to, they end up preferring a second, third, fourth composition than the original composition. And regardless of whether conditions improve or not, often we find that you just end up with better photos if you've taken photos from a variety of places rather than just standing in one spot and hoping for improvements. It's not always the case, obviously. Sometimes you miss out because you've moved, but more often than not, in my experience, you're better off moving. Tip number 4 is to take more than one photo at any given place of any given composition. And I understand the resistance to this one because there is a romance about arriving at a place, taking one photo and then packing your gear away. It's quite a clean transaction with a location. But the thing is, particularly if you're like me and you like to handhold, often you can end up getting a not particularly sharp shot if you're handholding, if you just take one photo, or even if you're not handholding, there might be motion blur in the scene that you don't spot in camera when you're out shooting. There could be a load of things that go wrong in one particular photo that you don't spot out in the field, and if you'd just taken a second, a third, a fourth, then you wouldn't have to worry that that one file was all you had. So yeah, another one that, as far as I'm concerned, there's very little downside for, other than filling cards, again obviously, but cards are cheap and very light. Tip number 5 is to use a custom profile. Now, if you don't know what custom profiles or custom modes are, basically you often see them at the top of the main dial on cameras. They might be listed as C1, C2, C3, or maybe just a number. And basically it's a collection of settings that you predetermine, and every time you turn your camera off and on, provided you're in one of those custom settings, then the settings will always appear the same when you turn the camera on. And this is really handy if you're in situations where you want to turn a camera on and take a shot within 1 or 2 seconds. And I know that for lots of you, that's probably very rare. Lots of you who watch this channel are kind of more traditional landscape photographers, whereby you might take your camera out and you're not going to be taking a picture for 5 or 10 minutes. Although we should take a picture as soon as we arrive at a location, as I was saying before. But yeah, most of the time you might not be in a rush to take a photo. However, I would imagine that for most of us, if we're in a place and a golden eagle flies over our heads and our camera's turned off, we're gonna want to be in a position to take a picture of it. And so having predetermined settings that enable that can only be a good thing. So for the sake of argument, you might want to set up a mode that's at f8, so most things are going to be in focus, and that has a shutter speed that's conducive to stopping most motion blur. So let's say, a 500th of a second. And then auto ISO to make sure that your ISO can cope in conditions where maybe the light isn't that sympathetic to high shutter speeds. Minimum shutter speed, I find an incredible tool. I've made a video about minimum shutter speeds, and yeah, I'd recommend having that set in a custom profile too. And finally, tip number 6 is always keep your camera out, which I do with the use of this peak design capture, which I've spoken about so much on this channel, purely because it's probably the best photography tool I have ever spent money on. Basically, as I'm sure you've seen, the camera just slots in there like that and sits on my shoulder, meaning I've always got access to it, very, very quick access, without it having to be in my hands or dangling around my waist on a strap. So those last 2 things combined mean I'm always primed for any golden eagles. It's not happened yet, but maybe one day. So yeah, I think it's good practice, as I've spoken about loads before, to make sure that your camera is out from the minute you leave the car to the minute you get back, because you never know what is around the corner. Anyway, speaking of bags, we've not really been speaking of bags, we've been speaking about the thing that's on the bag, but bags. I mentioned last week, as you might remember, that I had some camera bags to give away because I've got way too many of them. I've just got a new one, which was last week's video, and yeah, I need to get rid of some. So this is one of those bags. It's called a Mindshift Backlight 26 litre, fantastic bag. It's got back access to make sure that you can get easy and ample access to all your camera gear, as well as lots of storage for other stuff. This has been all over the world with me. I absolutely love it. I just won't be using it anymore because I have other bags that do a very similar job. The other one, a very similar bag, but just black and a different company. This is a Low Pro Tactic, I think. And again, side access and back access and top access to all your camera gear. Built super tough. I mean, these have got scars, these bags. As I said, I've used them both all over the world, but perfectly serviceable, and hopefully they'll find a good home. Now, I mentioned last week I needed ideas of how to give them away, and some of you said things like photo contests. I don't really want to do that, to be honest, because I want these bags to go to people who might not be winning photo contests, if that makes sense. Beginners, essentially, people who don't have photo bags who would benefit from photo bags the most. So if that sounds like you, if you don't have a photo bag, if you'd like a photo bag, if you think you'd use a photo bag an awful lot, then please comment under this video, I would like a camera bag, and then I'll pick at random some of those comments, 2 of those comments, and you shall be sent a camera bag. Please don't comment that if you're in a position to buy a camera bag, if you already have a camera bag, or if you don't think you'd use one of these specific bags all that often, because yeah, I just want to make sure that these go to a really good home where they're going to be used a lot. Anyway, thank you for watching, and a big thank you to this week's video sponsor, Skillshare. So Skillshare is an amazing online platform where you can learn all kinds of stuff from photography, design, creative writing, illustration, business, productivity, all kinds of different stuff. And speaking of beginner photographers, it's a great place to learn how to turn a hobby into a side hustle, how to start a business, how to find your creative voice. There's all kinds of different classes for those kinds of people. And I have definitely benefited from those kinds of classes massively. I mean, at the moment, I'm still on the InDesign stuff that I was talking about a couple of months back, which is teaching me how to put my book together. Super useful, as is so much of the stuff that's on Skillshare. I really recommend you checking it out, and the first 1,000 people to do so will get access to a free trial of Skillshare, and yeah, it's awesome. So a big thank you to Skillshare for their continued support of this channel and for hosting such amazing content. And a big thank you to you for watching. I'm going to go for a sleep. Definitely. Big sleep.